Brown? Yep, so we'll go to Senator Brown and then Senator Steeljohn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President and Senator Steeljohn. I rise to take note of the government response to the Joint Standing Committee on the NDIS final report of the committee's inquiry into planning. When the committee released its final report, we made 42 recommendations, all of which were aimed at improving the planning process from a participant's perspective. The committee conducted this inquiry in response to years of advocacy from participants, carers, supporters, advocates and groups in the sector who were calling for reform. Of those recommendations, the government has chosen to support 9 in principle, 17 in support, and then note 16 remaining recommendations. In this inquiry, the committee published 157 submissions and conducted 14 public hearings. As every NDIS participant knows, NDIS planning, along with access, is the primary point at which participants interact with the scheme. So it goes without saying that a good planning process can change life for the better. And it's pleasing to note that the government's recognition of the importance of providing participants to information about their plans prior to their planning meeting. Now, during the inquiry, Madam Deputy President, the committee received extensive evidence about the many inconsistencies in the planning process and plan funding. Some plans did not include funded supports because, in the view of the planner or agency, the participants had access to informal supports, and informal supports essentially means carers supporting the participant, because that's essentially what the NDIS were falling back on, that a participant was going to be assisted by members of their family. The committee also heard of discrepancies in funding and support between siblings with the same disability type. It is heartening that the government acknowledges the important role the NDIA has in assisting families and carers of people with disability in the planning process. And this is an issue that has been ongoing for a very, very long time. However, the committee's recommendation that caregivers be provided with written information about the types of support that the NDIS can fund remains very, very important. Participants and their advocates have long advocated for specialist planners for participants who are hospitalised to assist with a smooth transition. The government's support of this recommendation is welcome. These transitions and other similar experiences can create uncertainty and gaps in support for people with disability. It is essential that various levels of governments and their agencies work together to support some of our most vulnerable citizens. The appointment of 24 health liaison officers nationally is a good first step towards achieving this. Many participants in the NDIS have complex needs and need to access the complex sports needs pathway. The committee recommended that the NDIA publish more information about this pathway, including the information on who is eligible and how the NDIA defines the term complex sport support needs. I note that the NDIA is currently undertaking a review of the pathway, but would remind government and the agency that more information provided to participants and supporters and advocates, the better. Clear advice and information are central to the planning process succeeding, and this was throughout the inquiry one of the central messages that we received around information and clear advice. And it's very clear that that advice that participants and their families are receiving is not clear and not consistent. So work towards ensuring that it is clear and consistent is welcomed. Another key element is ensuring that there is trust in the decision-making of the agency in the resourcing and transparency of the appeals process. The need for many of these appeals arise because participants never meet with the NDI delegate who makes the decision on their plan. For too long, the NDIA was slow to respond to appeals lodged with the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. Recent improvements are welcome, but the priority of resourcing this task must be maintained. Leaving NDIS participants living with the uncertainty is not good enough and must be addressed by the agency. During our inquiry, we also heard about the impact that planning errors had on participants. Initial plans and review have often been undertaken by a planner without any knowledge of the participant's disability, and this is an ongoing issue. And the stories of planners relying on search engines while conducting meetings with participants are legend. In responding to the many of the recommendations in this review, the government notes recent announcements or reviews. But as we all know, an announcement does not mean that the issue has been resolved. Announcements do not provide us with hope and provide us with an acknowledgement that the government has recognised the need to address the issue. One of the announcements that the government is relying on in its response to this report is their recent commitment to the introduction of independent assessments. The government's determination to now rely on these assessments has already caused a great deal of alarm and concern in the disability community. This supposed reform was announced without adequate consultation and consideration of the needs of NDIS participants. That is why the Joint Standing Committee on NDIS is already conducting a separate inquiry into independent assessments. There are roughly 440,000 people with disability on the NDIS. The rollout of independent assessment is a radical plan. You can't help but wonder if the sole aim of this radical plan is cost-cutting. They all have to prove they have a disability and they've been assessed as being eligible to participate in the scheme. What the government is now proposing is that these 440,000 participants that effectively have to re-qualify for the scheme. In the words of the Shadow Minister for the NDIS, people with disability have effectively been asked to re-audition for the same money they're already getting, to a complete stranger, not to the medical specialists that they've been used to over the years or already received medical reports from, but from a panel of medical people that they need to select from. Now, we know they've had to convince a range of medical, they've already had to convince a range of medical and allied health professionals and NDIS officials that they're eligible for the NDIS. The rollout of independent assessment is a radical plan, and you have to wonder, because I can tell you right now, advocates and participants are wondering whether this is not just a way of cost-cutting, cutting people's plans. The reality is this reform is based on shaky evidence and doesn't necessarily promise a fix for the problems with consistency and fairness in planning that's outlined in this report. They say, the government says that there's a new approach for planning which will be underpinned by the introduction of independent assessments later in 2021. Well, advocates and participants are really very unsure about, at best, very unsure about how this process is going to work. At worst, believe that this is a way to cut their support, but also add stress to the planning process. It is stressful, and you can imagine, if you had to go through it, how stressful it would be to be able to talk to somebody, and at the moment perhaps talk to somebody that doesn't even understand anything about your disability, doesn't understand anything about your disability or the supports that you need. And here we have the government introducing independent assessments and lauding it as some sort of reform that's going to fix the issue around having fully costed detailed draft plans. Well, that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen because they don't talk to participants or advocates or
Thank you,
family
Senator
members.
Brown. Your time has expired.